History of the World by J. M. Roberts. Book 6 The Great Acceleration. Chapter 3 Political Change A New Europe. There was much more to Marx than this, but this was a striking and encouraging message which gave him domination of the international socialist movement that emerged in the next 20 years. The assurance that history was on their side was a great tonic to the revolutionaries. They learnt with gratitude that the cause to which they were impelled anyway by motives ranging from a sense of injustice to the promptings of envy was predestined to triumph. This was essentially a religious faith, for all its intellectual possibilities as an analytical instrument. Marxism came to be above all a popular mythology, resting on a view of history which said that men were bound by necessity because their institutions were determined by evolving methods of production, and on a faith that the working class were the chosen people whose pilgrimage through a wicked world would end in the triumphal establishment of a just society in which necessity's iron law would cease to operate. Social revolutionaries could thus feel confident of scientifically irrefutable arguments for irresistible progress towards the socialist millennium, while clinging to a revolutionary activism it seemed to make unnecessary. Marx himself seems to have followed his teachings more cautiously, applying it only to the broad, sweeping changes in history which individuals are powerless to resist, and not to its detailed unfolding. Perhaps it is not surprising that, like many masters, he did not recognize all his pupils. He came later to protest that he was not a Marxist. This new religion was an inspiration to working class organization. Trades unions and cooperatives already existed in some countries. The first international organization of working men appeared in 1863, though it included many who did not subscribe to Marx's views, anarchists among others. His influence was paramount within it. He was its secretary. Its name frightened conservatives, some of whom blamed the Paris Commune on it. Whatever their justification, their instincts were right. What happened in the years after 1848 was that socialism captured the revolutionary tradition from the liberals, and a belief in the historical role of an industrial working class, still barely visible outside England, let alone predominant in most countries, was tacked on to the tradition which held that, broadly speaking, revolution could not be wrong. Forms of thinking about politics evolved in the French Revolution were thus transferred to societies to which they would prove increasingly inappropriate. How easy such a transition could be shown by the way Marx snapped up the drama and mythical exaltation of the Paris Commune for socialism. In a powerful tract, he annexed it to his own theories, though it was, in fact, the product of many complicated and differing forces and expressed very little in the way of egalitarianism, let alone scientific socialism. It emerged, moreover, in a city which, though huge, was not one of the great manufacturing centers in which he predicted proletarian revolution would mature. These remained instead stubbornly quiescent. The Commune was, in fact, the last and greatest example of revolutionary and traditional Parisian radicalism. It was a great failure, and socialism suffered from it too because of the repressive measures it provoked. Yet Marx made it central to socialist mythology. Russia seemed, except in her Polish lands, immune to the disturbances troubling other continental great powers. The French Revolution had been another of those experiences which, like feudalism, Renaissance, and Reformation, decisively shaped Western Europe and passed Russia by. Although Alexander I, the Tsar under whom Russia met the 1812 invasion, had indulged himself with liberal ideas and had even thought of a constitution, nothing seemed to come of this. A formal liberalization of Russian institutions did not begin until the 1860s, and even then, its source was not revolutionary contagion. It is true that liberalism and revolutionary ideologies did not quite leave Russia untouched before this. Alexander's reign had seen something of an opening of a Pandora's box of ideas, and it had thrown up a small group of critics of the regime who found their models in Western Europe. Some of the Russian officers who went there with the armies which pursued Napoleon to Paris were led by what they saw and heard to make unfavorable comparisons with their homeland. This was the beginning of Russian political opposition. In an autocracy, opposition was bound to mean conspiracy. Some of them took part in the organization of secret societies which attempted to cause a coup amid the uncertainty caused by the death of Alexander in 1825. This was called the Decembrist movement. It soon collapsed, but only after giving a fright to Nicholas I, a Tsar who decisively and negatively affected Russia's historical destiny at a crucial moment by ruthlessly turning on political liberalism and seeking to crush it in part because of the immobility which he imposed. Nicholas's reign influenced Russia's destiny more than any since that of Peter the Great. A dedicated believer in autocracy, he confirmed the Russian tradition of authoritarian bureaucracy, the management of cultural life, and the rule of secret police, which, when the other great conservative powers were, however, unwilling, beginning to move in the opposite direction. There was, of course, much to build on already in the historical legacies which differentiated Russian autocracy from the Western European monarchy. But there were also great challenges to be met, and Nicholas's reign was a response to these as well as a simple deployment of the old methods of despotism by a man determined to use them. The ethnic, linguistic, and geographical diversity of the empire had begun to pose problems far outrunning the capacity of Muscovite tradition to deal with them. The population of the empire itself more than doubled in the 40 years after 1770. This ever diversifying society, nonetheless, remained overwhelmingly backward. Its few cities were hardly a part of the vast rural expanses in which they stood and often seemed insubstantial and impermanent, more like huge temporary encampments than settled centers of civilization. The greatest expansion had been to the south and southeast. Here, new elites had to be incorporated in the imperial structure, and to stress the religious ties between the Orthodox was one of the easiest ways to do this. As the conflict with Napoleon had compromised the old prestige of things, French and the skeptical ideas of the Enlightenment associated with that country, a new emphasis was now given to religion in the evolution of a new ideological basis for the Russian Empire under Nicholas. Official nationality, as it was called, was Slavophile and religious in doctrine, bureaucratic in form, and strove to give Russia an ideological unity it had lost since outgrowing its historic center in Muscovy. The importance of official ideology was from this time one of the great differences between Russia and Western Europe. Until the last decade of the 20th century, Russian governments were never to give up their belief in ideology as a unifying force. Yet, this did not mean that daily life in the middle of the century, either for the civilized classes or the mass of a backward population, was much different from that of other parts of Eastern and Central Europe. Yet, Russian intellectuals argued about whether Russia was or was not a European country, and this is not surprising. Russia's roots were different from those of countries further west. What is more, a decisive turn was taken under Nicholas, from the beginning of whose reign possibilities of change were at least being felt in other dynastic states in the first half of the 19th century, were simply not allowed to appear in Russia. It was the land par excellence of censorship and police. In the long run, this was bound to exclude certain possibilities of modernization, though other obstacles rooted in Russian society seem equally important. But in the short run, it was highly successful. Russia passed through the whole 19th century without revolution. Revolts in Russia, Poland in 1830 to 1831 and 1863 to 1864 were ruthlessly surpassed, the more easily because Poles and Russians cherished traditions of mutual dislike. The other side of the coin was the almost continuous violence and disorder of a savage and primitive rural society, and a mounting and more violent tradition of conspiracy, which perhaps incapacitated Russia even further for normal politics and the shared assumptions they required. Unfriendly critics variously described Nicholas's reign as an ice age, a plague zone, and a prison. But not for the last time in Russian history, the preservation of a harsh and unyielding despotism at home was not incompatible with a strong international role. This rested upon Russia's huge military superiority. When armies contended with muzzle loaders and no important weaponry distinguished one from another, her vast numbers were decisive. On Russian military strength rested the anti revolutionary international security system, as 1849 showed. But Russian foreign policy had other successes too. Pressure was consistently kept up on the Central Asian Khanates and on China. The left bank of the Amur became Russian, and in 1860, Vladivostok was founded. Great concessions were exacted from Persia, and during the 19th century, Russia absorbed Georgia and a part of Armenia. For a time, there was even a determined effort to pursue Russian expansion in North America, where there were forts in Alaska and settlements in Northern California until 1840s. The major effort of Russian foreign policy, nevertheless, was directed to the southwest towards Ottoman Europe. Wars in 1806 to 1812 and 1828 carried the Russian frontier across Bessarabia to the Pruth and the mouth of the Danube. It was by then clear that the partition of the Ottoman Empire in Europe would be as central to 19th century diplomacy as the partition of Poland had been to that of the 18th. But there was an important difference. The interests of more powers were involved this time, and the complicating factor of national sentiment among the subject peoples of Ottoman Empire would make an agreed outcome much more difficult. As it happened, the Ottoman Empire survived far longer than might have been expected, and an Eastern question is still bothering statesmen. Some of these complicating factors led to the Crimean War, which began with the Russian occupation of Ottoman provinces on the lower Danube. In Russia's internal affairs, the war was more important than in those of any other country. It revealed that the military colossus of the 1815 restoration now no longer enjoyed an unquestioned superiority. She was defeated on her own territory and obliged to accept a peace which involved the renunciation for the foreseeable future of her traditional goals in the Black Sea area. Fortunately, in the middle of the war, Nicholas I had died. This simplified the problems of his successor. Defeat meant that change had to come. Some modernization of Russian institutions was unavoidable if Russia was again to generate a power commensurate with her vast potential, which had become unrealizable within her traditional framework. When the Crimean War broke out, there was still no Russian railway south of Moscow. Russia's once important contribution to European industrial production had already grown since 1800 and was now far outstripped by others. Her agriculture remained one of the least productive in the world, and yet her population steadily rose, pressing harder upon its resources. It was in these circumstances that Russia at last underwent radical change. Though less dramatic than many upheavals in the rest of Europe, it was in fact more of a revolution than much that went by that name elsewhere. For what was at last uprooted was the institution which lay at the very roots of Russian life serfdom. Its extension had been the leading characteristic of Russian social history since the 17th century. Even Nicholas had agreed that serfdom was the central evil of Russian society. His reign had been marked by increasingly frequent serf insurrections, attacked on landlords, crop burning, and cattle maiming. The refusal of dues was almost the least alarming form of popular resistance to it. Yet it was appallingly difficult for the rider to get off the elephant. The vast majority of Russians were serfs. They could not be transformed overnight by mere legislative fiat into wage laborers or smallholders. Nor could the state accept the administrative burden which would suddenly be thrown upon it if the services discharged by the manorial system should be withdrawn and nothing put in their place. Nicholas had not dared to proceed. Alexander II did. After years of study of the evidence and possible advantages and disadvantages of different forms of abolition, the Tsar issued in 1861 the edict which marked an epoch in Russian history and won him the title of the Tsar Liberator. The one card Russian government could play was the unquestioned authority of the autocrat, and it was now put to good use. The edict gave the serfs personal freedom and ended bond labor. It was also to ensure for them allotments of land. But these were to be paid for by redemption charges whose purpose was to make the change acceptable to the landowners. To secure the repayments and offset the dangers of suddenly introducing a free labor market, peasants remained to a considerable degree subject to the authority of their village communities, which were given the charge of distributing the land allotments on a family basis. It would not be long before a great deal would be heard about the shortcomings of this settlement. Yet, there is much to be said for it, and in retrospect, it seems a massive achievement. Within a few years, the United States would emancipate its black slaves. There were far fewer of them than there were Russian serfs, and they lived in a country of much greater economic opportunity. Yet the effect of throwing them on the labor market exposed the pure theory of laissez faire economic liberalism was to exasperate a problem with whose ultimate consequences the United States was still grappling a century later. In Russia, the largest measure of social engineering in recorded history down to this time was carried out without comparable dislocation, and it opened the way to modernization for what was potentially one of the strongest powers on earth. It was the indispensable first step towards making the peasant look beyond the estate for available industrial employment. More immediately, liberation opened an era of reform. There followed other measures which, by 1870, gave Russia a representative system of local government and a reformed judiciary. When in 1871 the Russians took advantage of the Franco Prussian War to denounce some of the restrictions placed on their freedom in the Black Sea in 1856, there was almost a symbolic warning to Europe in what they did. After tackling her greatest problem and beginning to modernize her institutions, Russia was again announcing that she would, after all, be master in her own house. The resumption of the most consistently and long pursued policies of expansion in modern history was only a matter of time.